when I was locked in this cell, I wasn't told how long I would be there. And there was a chance it would be days, there was a chance it would be weeks, there was a fair chance it would be months, and then there was the outside chance it would be years. It was comfortably the hardest thing I've ever had to go through. The total removal of agency. They left 400 plus bodies strewn about the town. Not the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers they'd been fighting, but bodies of civilians. Children, elderly people with their hands tied behind their backs and executed with a bullet in the back of the head. Camped in temperatures down to minus 50 degrees, 65 Fahrenheit. It was a snake, and it bit me on the thumb, and turned out to be quite a dangerous viper. In fact, it's the world's the saw-scaled viper is the world's deadliest species of snake.
First of all, this is my voice. I'm Tim Green, and I have ALS. But this podcast isn't about ALS. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for me. I'm a father of 5, married for over 35 years, a New York Times best-selling author, an NFL first-round pick, and a practicing attorney. This is Nothing Left Unsaid, where my son Troy and I sit down with extraordinary people for raw, honest conversations about life, its toughest trials, and greatest triumphs. My voice in today's episode is powered by 11 Labs. Today on Nothing Left Unsaid, we are joined by an explorer who has pushed the limits of human endurance and curiosity. Charlie Walker has cycled over 43,000 miles through over 60 countries, trekked some of the harshest landscapes on Earth, and devoted his life to seeking out the limits of both the map and the human spirit. His journeys aren't just about distance. They are about culture, people, and the stories that only emerge when you stand far outside your comfort zone. We're going to talk about what drives someone to leave the ordinary, what he's learned from years on the road, and the lessons we can all take from a life lived in pursuit of adventure. Welcome to the show, Charlie.
It's a pleasure to be here. Troy, Tim, thank you both very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Charlie, what first drove you to this life of exploration?
Good question. In some ways, it's a question I wrestle with frequently because it's the question I'm asked most often. I suppose there's two answers. One is that it was lots and lots of incremental sort of inspirations and drivers that set me on this path. But I suppose the more basic elemental answer was it probably boils down to growing up in a very small village in a very sort of bucolic, beautiful but quiet and secluded part of England, southwest England. And I think from quite an early age, I was just curious. There had to be more out there, more to this world than farming. So I was keen from an early age to set out and explore further afield. The more I started dipping my toes in, the deeper and deeper I found myself wanting to go, until I've ended up going now to some of the sort of hardest to get to places on the planet that don't involve submarines.
What was the first kind of exploration though? Because it's from farming to the places you've been. There's got to be an in between, right?
Yeah, well, I should say I'm not a farmer. I'm not from a farming family myself. I'm just from essentially a farming community.
Farm town.
Yeah. I mean, the village has, I think, 250 people. It's very small. The first travel besides sort of family holidays to the beach in the south of England. When I left high school, I took a year out, or a gap year as we call it in the UK, and I spent about 4 months just with a backpack, traipsing around East and Southern Africa. And it was great. Part of it was for the first time being sort of an adult, truly alone, cut off from the sort of comforts and reassurances of home. And I saw beautiful places, sand dunes in Namibia and Victoria Falls in Zambia, and just all these beautiful things, wildlife in East Africa. But I quickly realized the things that most fired my imagination, the places I got the biggest kick out of visiting, were, broadly speaking, unspectacular. They were just small, remote, out of the way places, the hinterland of the countries that I happened to be passing through. And so I soon developed a habit for getting on a bus, going to wherever it ended, and then just checking it out for a bit. And usually it would be, sort of mundane to, of course, everyone there, but just fascinating to me, because the further you go from the access to the outside world, the more the trappings of that outside world that I'm familiar with drop away, and the more you get a sense of what perhaps life was like 10, 20, or even 100 years earlier.
That's so interesting. When you set out on a 43,000 mile bike ride, did people around you think you were crazy? What did you tell them?
I think a lot of them still do, to be honest.
I was going to say, me too. I'll go in that bucket. A 43,000 mile bike ride. You're nuts.
I didn't. I mean, in that case, I know I said I sort of built up to these sorts of things, but in that case, I kind of didn't. I went on a 2 week bike ride as soon as I left university. And that was just it was about 1,000 miles from Beijing to the Mongolian capital, Ulaanbaatar, and crossing the Gobi Desert. And truth be told, I didn't actually love it, but I did get a sense during those 2 weeks of kind of hard graft in the desert. A lot of it was roadless. I was just following kind of vague desert tracks. I got a sense during that time of the potential of bicycle travel, of how affordable it was, how much you really felt and experienced with every sense the places you're passing through. You have the wind in your face, you've got the sun burning the back of your neck or your arms or whatever it might be. You can really smell the places you pass through. And you're also traveling at a pace that is not as painfully slow as walking, about 3 miles an hour, which I then did years later, that same route, and not as sort of deprivingly fast as driving, where you can just whiz through hundreds and hundreds of miles in a day. On a bicycle, you're going maybe, if the roads are good, 100 miles in a day. If the roads are bad, maybe 40, 50, 60 miles in a day. And the combination of all those factors just seemed like a really, really great way to get to really see the places that I was traveling through. So I came back from that journey and told my parents, I'm going to go on a really big journey. And I showed them a map. I had just on a single sheet of paper, a map of the world. And I had drawn these, like a child with a crayon. I'd kind of scratched these crude lines right the way across continents. And they looked at this sort of mad, etched plan. And they did think I was kind of crazy. But then when I explained that I wanted to be a travel writer and I wanted to go off and have journeys and then come back with plenty of material to write about, to launch into writing in books, they were pretty understanding. My parents in particular. It probably helps that I've got 3 siblings, so there are spares in the family. So there was. I believe you're one of 5, Troy, so you're perhaps expendable as well.
So your plan that looked like a crayon drawing, did you put a lot more time into that, or was that kind of I don't know, thrown together quickly?
Not really. I mean, the basic plan was to get from home in the UK back to home via the furthest away point of each of the 3 continents. I suppose you could call that the old world before the new world was discovered with the Americas. So the furthest away point in Europe was the top of Norway. Furthest away place in Asia was Singapore, and the furthest away place in Africa was Cape Agulhas, just close to Cape Town in South Africa, the most southerly point of Africa. And I chose those simply because there weren't oceans in the way, and so I wouldn't need to be getting expensive flights to cross oceans. It seemed like something. Once I'd got which I managed to blag for free, once I got a 20-mile crossing across the English Channel from England to France, then basically I could just keep going on a bicycle. There would be nothing to stop me from going kind of to the ends of the earth, or as it more literally was, to the end of the road. So the planning beyond that was sparse, and that caused me arguably a few problems along the way due to maybe lack of forethought or naivety. But I'm really glad that I didn't allow myself to get too waylaid or bogged down in the possible minutiae of trying to sort of play out every possible scenario. If you try and figure everything out, you're probably not going to get going, because there'll be so many problems and challenges. But if you just start, then you've committed to something, and you'll encounter those problems, but probably figure out a way to get past them because you're already on your way.
It's like the General Patton quote: "A good plan executed today is better than a perfect plan executed next week." Right?
Absolutely. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Yeah. No, I love that quote.
Yeah.
How do you push through the fear? Is there any, or were you pretty comfortable with the whole thing?
There's there's plenty of fear. I am. I mean, I've been doing these journeys for about 15 years, and of course, you get more accustomed to fear, to jeopardy, and you perhaps get better at rationalizing when you really are in danger. And I try. I think nowadays, largely, I experience rational fear rather than irrational fear, and that's largely a good thing. But my journeys are not paragons of achievement or excellence or endurance. I'm quite a haphazard guy. I sort of approach things badly, and I'm not superhuman. I'm not an endurance athlete. I just kind of bumble along at my own pace, giving it a go, and usually, it works out. When it doesn't, that's sometimes traumatic. But yeah, there's plenty of fear, and I suppose initially I would cope with it through, or rather, I don't know if it would be coping, but I would sidestep it through the fear of embarrassment. The fear of embarrassment is often, as a young man trying to kind of make his way in the world, setting out to make his mark. The fear of embarrassment can be more than the fear of immediate danger, or the idea of giving up and turning around and going home. So often it was essentially shame or embarrassment that drove me through some of the more challenging periods. As the years have gone by, that, thankfully, I'm glad to say, has become less the case. And now I think I try and broach fear, like I say, rationally. So if I'm scared, if I'm afraid of something for a rational reason, that's a good thing, and I listen to that. That doesn't mean I give into it, but I do allow it to influence my decisions and my planning.
What's the most surprising lesson you've learned from people living on the planet's fringes?
It's a good question. I suppose I'll give you two answers to that are sort of equal and opposite, I suppose. One is the world is so much more heterogeneous than we can ever possibly imagine. There is just such a near infinite variety of people, of types of people, of cultures, of languages. I've traveled a few times in Papua New Guinea, which is it's not a small country, but the population is somewhere between 10 and 20 million. They're not really sure. There's a lot of people living scattered around the highlands, in the mountains, and they're quite cut off and isolated. They have 850 languages in this one country. Now, those aren't dialects. That's not like someone from Texas speaking to someone from New York and sort of struggling to understand some of the patois. Those are totally distinct languages. So I've been amazed. My mind's been blown multiple times, but just how varied the human animal is, and yet at the same time, the near homogeneity perhaps, of human decency. I've got myself into sticky situations. I got myself in trouble in so many different parts of the world, and I have found pretty much invariably, if I'm in need of help and there is someone there, it doesn't matter where I am in the world, that person will do their best to help. And I suppose we often find it easy, or perhaps sometimes even tempting, to think that people are bad in some sense. Maybe even that the fundamental human is amoral or immoral. And I don't think that's the case. I think when people see people who need help, they will help those people.
How do you get over the language barriers?
I'm definitely no linguist. I've got, high school French that has helped in several parts of the world, in Africa, for example, and I can get by in Russian now, which also helps in numerous Russophone countries. Beyond that, it's a combination of trying hard to pick up as much as I possibly can in a short space of time, and I've got better at, I suppose, covering a relatively repetitive, limited vocabulary. I've learned just for the basic needs of communication, I've learned the important words that we need to kind of pick up on. It also has helped over the years. I've often traveled slowly, from country to country, moving through a region. And often that means that the last language that you were dealing with has some commonalities with the next language that you're dealing with, as you slowly work your way across the kind of the great sweep of human language groups. And then beyond that, it's just playing charades as good humouredly as you possibly can, and hoping that people people are patient and understanding, which they usually are. If you make a bit of a game of communicating in, let's say, a small Nigerian village, although that's not necessary, everyone there really speaks some English. Let's say a small village in Benin, then people are gonna generally try to understand you, and you might have imperfect communication, but at least you'll have some fun while doing it.
Is there any difference in that, like the willingness to help and the willingness to try to communicate when you first started, maybe 15 years ago, say, to now? Like in my head, based on like the media, I would guess that people are less willing to help now, but have you found that to be the case or no?
I haven't found that to be the case at all. I mean, I suppose I would refer you to my last question, but one, and we are. I was about to say misinformed. I don't think that's quite fair. I think we are often accidentally misdirected by the sort of quote unquote state of the world. Things always look terrible and bleak, but that's because they're on the news, and the news is by default the extraordinary, not the ordinary. And although there are trends in the world that I don't love right now that have been playing out for the last decade and a half, 2 decades, generally speaking, the world is still a kind and helpful place. And I mean, I've spent about half a year in Iran, for example, a place that is, as I'm sure you're aware, no fan of Britain or the US. They refer to us as the great satans of the sort of morally degenerate West, in the words of the rhetoric of the regime, I should say, not necessarily what all the people think. Incidentally, the America is viewed as the great Satan and Britain is viewed as the little Satan. But the belief is that the little Satan is pulling the puppet strings of the great Satan. So we're the really nefarious ones, and you guys get off scot-free just with your big clumsy might. Anyway, the point of this is that I've travelled in Iran and I've heard people say things that I find quite shocking about their beliefs about the West, about Britain, about America, but they hold no personal animosity towards me, and therefore it seems only sort of fair and collegiate to try and extend the same attitude in reverse. Most countries will have some people, sometimes a majority, sometimes minority, who don't feel represented by, let's say, the powers that be. That's been the case for swathes of both my country and your country at different times, and for different people at different times over, let's say, the last 20 years, and probably seems set to be the way that things continue. And I suppose that understanding has helpfully informed the way I kind of view and deal with people.
Yeah, honestly, I'm glad to hear that.
It's frustrating how the media paints a picture of division among us, but it's not there for most people. To someone like you who is from the West but has sat with hunters on the Siberian tundra and with villagers deep in the Congo, what is the common thread you've seen that unites all people as one?
Ooh, it's a great question. I think we all have, the common thread is we all want to live a life well lived. Where that thread phrase and separates is that we all have different ideas of what that means, but the basic fundamental is we are all looking to, where possible, as far as possible, be happy, be healthy, look after the people we care about, be looked after by the people who care about us, and have some fun. And that fun might be dancing, it might be singing, it might be reading, it might be sport, whatever it is. But we do have, I think, remarkably similar basic drivers.
It's kind of a loaded question, but when you go to these places, whether it's the last stop on the bus or, biking through New Guinea or the Congo or whatever, do you see things, lifestyles or habits that people are doing that, if you had a magic wand and you can make everybody in the UK or the US or, the West, so to speak, are there things that you see them doing that you're like, man, I wish we did more of that? And maybe it's, a pastime that we got away from?
Yeah. I suppose and I've been thinking more about this particularly in the last 2-3 years. I suppose the first thing that springs to mind is, and this will sound counterintuitive, but boredom, allowing oneself to be and become bored. I think we are so overstimulated, so quick to turn to a phone or switch on a TV or whatever it might be, plug in a podcast, all of which are great things and totally valid and have their place. But I think even when I look back to my youth in the 1990s and the noughties, we were fine with being bored and sometimes just throwing stones and staring into space, and there are still many parts of the world where you see people just sitting around staring into space. And I think the sort of Western instinct there is to think that that's idleness or something along those lines, and sure, sometimes it can be, but generally I think it's quite a healthy mind that occasionally just sort of lapses into blankness and then sort of stares inwardly or outwardly for a little while. On the flip side of that, many of the places I have traveled, I would say, have things that we can learn from in the opposite direction, or that I wouldn't want to venerate or duplicate, such as the position of women in society or the treatment of animals, etc., etc. Quite obvious, easy things to say, but I'm always wary of simplifying other societies and other parts of the world that are nuanced in their differences.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's so crazy. I can't even imagine even trying. Like the thought to get on a bike and ride through Africa is just. I can't even.
That came off the back of 2.5 years in Asia first, that I sort of thought I was quite well prepared. But Africa is a slightly more intense assault on the senses, I think, as a travel experience.
Both Asia and Africa are unbelievable journeys. All right, Charlie, multiple part question. Did you see faith expressed differently in remote communities than at home? Do you have any kind of faith that you feel guided you on this life? And finally, faith and family have been the foundation that I've rebuilt my life around since my ALS diagnosis. Have you ever leaned into that foundation?
Great questions, the big questions, and I will.
All at once too.
After I know, and also the last part of the question, just why everything. I was raised Anglican, so Protestant Christian, and I was raised with faith, and gradually through my teenage years that waned. Over the years, I suppose that's been replaced with, for want of a better term, humanism. I think that the fundamental that I take from Christianity and from dozens of other faith systems, I suppose, is that golden rule of love thy neighbor, etc. So that's sort of where I am at with that. I mean, I'm from the UK, which was a fairly irreligious, broadly speaking, faithless society or nation when I was growing up, and is now, I think, yet more so. We have a census every 10 years. The most recent one was 2021, and for the last few decades, every 10 years, the percentage of people who self-refer as practicing Christians goes down about 10%. So that trend in this country, at least, looks set to continue. When I've traveled further afield, I've seen very often and in multitudinous ways how central faith is to so many different people's lives in so many different ways. I suppose it's fair to say that I've also seen some of the more nefarious, I was going to say exhibitions of faith, but I'm going to say uses of religious systems, because it's not really about faith in what I'm talking about here. So I have a, as you can see, because I'm talking myself slowly round and round and down the plug hole, I have a complicated and sort of ongoing discussion with myself on this topic. And I think it's a, it's an each to their own thing. And if people can find, use and positivity and value in it, then I'm absolutely all for it. I recently was reading a study by a bunch of atheist scientists found that that faith is beneficial to one's health. A huge study has found that the health outcomes for people with faith are more positive than those without. Whether that means that us heathens are more prone to booze and cigarettes to sort of fill the void, who knows? I'm sure there's many potential sort of answers or explainers to kind of lace those findings with. Unfortunately, when you don't have belief, it's not as easy as reading a study that suggests it might be a good idea to find it. So that's where I find myself. I can't remember the exact parts of the question, but I think I've covered most of them.
You got the multiple parts.
You've made friends all over the world, but the people who knew you first were at home. What do you want listeners to know about your family, the things you're proudest of when you talk about them?
My family, I think, have massively informed who I am and the way I am, in particular my parents. My father's no longer with us, but my mum and dad were both staunch advocates of, I suppose, patience and decency, I think, would be their two core morals. And I still don't really feel I need to look far afield to get or refresh my guidance on who I should be trying to be as a person. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm always achieving that, but no, I've had a very, very strong, positive and uninsistent role models in my life from an early age. They've been extremely good at providing guidance without laying down any parameters, if that makes any sense. I and my three siblings have all been given massive latitude to explore our interests and make our mistakes, and there's always been a loving cushion to fall into when I fuck things up.
What did your siblings say? I was just thinking about when you brought up your siblings. Like if my brother were to call me and say, "Hey man, I'm going to take my bike and I'm going to ride to Argentina," I'd say you're out of your effing mind. Like, what did your siblings say? What do you do? Like, they try and talk you out of it, or no?
No, there was no trying to talk me out of it. I suspect they probably saw it coming more than my parents did. So I think probably less surprised. And by the time I made that decision to go away on a bicycle for nearly half a decade, I'd gone off on a number of different backpacking journeys to then, and it had almost become, the expected that as soon as Charlie gets the hint of an opportunity, he'll disappear to the back of beyond, and he will come back, but it might not be soon. In fact, my elder sister, when I set off on that bicycle trip, she lives up in Scotland, and she came down to visit. And I mean, it was such a bad bicycle. I had a shopping basket on the front, like an old lady might have on her way to pick up, milk and eggs. But she picked some lavender from my parents' garden and tied it to the basket and said, "Well, now even if there's headwinds, they'll smell fresh the whole way to China," which was a nice thought.
I love that support from your sister. So your parents watched you trade stability for uncertainty. How did they respond, and how has their support stayed with you across 60,000 miles?
That number is so crazy still.
I think they were remarkably understanding, and perhaps more so than even I expected them to be. It was, I mean, my dad was just in absolute pieces when I left home, just crying so much. And I'm told my mum, the minute I cycled down the pathway and round the corner in the village was in the same state, but had managed to not sort of show that to me. I think the way in which, so that was 2010 when I first started doing big journeys like this. And I think it was a slightly different world to today. although it wasn't technically pre-smartphones. I think the first iPhone was about 2008. It was pre anyone I know having any of them. And I set off without a bicycle. Sorry, I set off on a bicycle without a phone. And for the following several years, I was not entirely incommunicado. I would send emails as and when I could, but I was sort of out of reach. And that was more normalized then. Whereas now, with the advent of eSIMs or picking up a cheap SIM card once you've crossed the border into, let's say, Tajikistan, and then having, cell service, 3G, 4G, even 5G, pretty much wherever you are, people are now able to be in touch constantly. And I think that makes it both harder to go away and harder to be away. I think the expectation from family, from loved ones, is that you'll be in touch almost daily, perhaps hourly. And if you're not, then perhaps something is wrong. Whereas just 15 years ago, 10 years ago, you could disappear into the Congo for 2 months and there would be the sort of the trust basis that you would come out the other side. And when you did, as and when you did, you'd pop up and say hello. So I think it was a slightly different world. So a slightly tangential answer there, but it does feel like it was very different back then.
Do you ever like now, do you take advantage of those, I guess, of that technology? Like if you were to do a trip now, you could hypothetically, basically stream the entire thing. And I feel like now almost a Forrest Gump level, but I feel like it would get so much exposure. I don't know if you saw, there was that thing, I'm going to probably butcher his name. It was like Ryan Terhune or Terhune. He did he drove, I think, all 50 states in 50 days, something like that in the US. And he raised millions of dollars for St. Jude's. And the first video had, 100,000, watches, whatever it was on YouTube. And then by the end, it was getting, they were getting, I believe tens of millions. I feel like you could do something like that now with your, on your bike with the
Yeah,
technology. And
I mean, I see that, and I actually wasn't aware of Ryan, but that sounds fantastic, particularly that he had managed to raise so much money for a good cause. I definitely don't underestimate the power, the potential of these new technologies. I haven't massively adopted them. I'm a bit of a Luddite, I think it turns out. Perhaps willfully so. I am aware that I could be live streaming things when I go away, but for two reasons I choose not to. The first is that I feel that my medium is writing, so I would rather come the end. I mean, last year and this year, January, February last year and January, February this year, I went on a bicycle back to West Africa and sort of filled in a section of my original journey that I'd been unable to do a decade earlier due to the Ebola crisis. And I had a phone with me. I have a wife to update, and it's a different time, and it really diminished the experience. So I would rather at the end of each day, instead of once I get in my tent and I sort of uncomfortably hunched over eating a meal of rice and onion or something, once I've done that, I'd rather write down my notes for the day, my thoughts, my feelings, the people I saw, the things I learned in a notebook, than spend time hunched over a laptop or with a phone editing and dealing with the footage that I've captured during that day. So for that reason I prefer not to, but I think the more important reason is it takes you out of the moment. Even just having a phone means that you're not less able to necessarily, but you're probably less inclined to really get beneath the skin of a place, to really immerse. You have access to the news. You can find out what's going on in the outside world. So that sense of isolation, of distance has gone. And I think those senses are an important part of what a journey is. And I do think that when I go on a journey, it is both inward and outward. I'm outwardly going through a place and meeting people and learning things, but I'm also inwardly moving and learning. And I think particularly the latter of those two things can be more challenging when you've got this magic line to the outside world.
Yeah, it's funny when you were responding to that, I was thinking like writing it down seems more authentic than streaming it. which also it should be the opposite, right? You'd think streaming would be more authentic because it's really you, but it's all edited and
I don't think either is more authentic. I suppose it's. I mean, both have, in some sense, a veneer of edit. When my next book comes out next year, it's by no means the journal I wrote down in Siberia.
sure, that's
It
true.
is. It is. There is an artistic portrayal. There is a edit process. This is not interesting. That's interesting. Let's have more of that and less of that. But at the same time, you can do, you do that with footage as well. It's just not my expertise. It arguably is where the future is going and where money is to be made. But I've dug my trench and I'll keep plowing it.
It still does seem like I know we'll disagree on this one, but it still seems like something about having the video on in like a streaming sense. It's almost like too much pressure because the reality is no one's life is interesting 24/7. So it's almost like you almost not fake controversy, but I don't know. It's there's something about it that feels, I guess,
I,
fake.
I hear what you're saying. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Charlie, I have to ask, can you take us back to the 4 weeks you were in a Russian prison? What was that like?
It was no picnic. Um, as someone who was sent to boarding school for 10 years, I guess I was in some sense prepared for confinement to a room and bad food. That's not entirely fair on the schools that I went to, but yeah, it was an experience unlike any other, and it was comfortably the hardest thing I've ever had to go through. The thing I found hardest about, well, the two things I found hardest about it. One was the indefinite nature of it. When I was locked in this cell, I wasn't told how long I would be there. And there was a chance it would be days, there was a chance it would be weeks, there was a fair chance it would be months, and then there was the outside chance it would be years, depending on whether my story managed to work itself far enough up the kind of power vertical towards Moscow, where someone might realize, oh, we've got a British guy in a prison locked up. We've already taken him to court and found him guilty. We could always escalate those charges, and then we've got ourselves a useful pawn, a bargaining chip for potential hostage diplomacy, as happened to Brittany Griner and Evan Gershkovich and numerous other people from Western countries or with dual nationality. That was the first thing that I really struggled with. The second was just the total removal of agency. I'm quite an independent person. I like to, I work for myself. I have always done my own thing. And suddenly having all decision, all agency removed, all that was left to me is how to pass the time within the limited parameters of that cell. So am I going to do some more sit-ups or some more push-ups, or am I going to walk backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards yet more today, or am I just going to lie on the bunk and stare at the ceiling and feel bad for myself? So those two things in tandem were a fairly toxic cocktail.
Charlie, what's the story? How did you end up in that
Yeah, sorry,
prison?
I should probably précis. So I went to a region in the far east of Russia called Yakutia, or Sakha Republic, in February 2022, with the plan to spend a few weeks, couple months, hiking along an ice road cleared on a frozen river. So far up in the Arctic, in the north of Russia. So it's the coldest inhabited region on Earth. The town that I started my hike in is about 20 miles from what's called the Pole of Cold, which is where the settlement with the coldest recorded temperature, which was minus 67.8 degrees. That's Celsius. I don't know what that becomes in Fahrenheit, minus 80 or something like that. So that was my plan. Unfortunately, in some sense for me, but obviously much more so for the tens of millions of people in Ukraine, and in particular in eastern Ukraine. Just a few days after I arrived in Russia, the invasion, Putin launched his illegal invasion of eastern Ukraine. When that happened, I was actually still in a city called Yakutsk, the regional capital, which is south of the Arctic Circle, big city, about 300,000 people. And so there was a slim opportunity of time there before all flights were cancelled for me to just beat a hasty retreat and get out of the country as quickly as possible. And arguably that would be a sensible thing to do. But as I've sort of hinted earlier, I've always been quite curious. And I realized that this opportunity, that I didn't look for, had fallen into my lap to, as essentially one of, if not the last Western tourist in Russia, to remain in the country, do what I was there to do, but meanwhile get a sense of, and perhaps even chart the evolving or changing attitudes of Russian people to this horrific new situation playing out on their sort of southwestern border, 3,000 miles away from, and 6 time zones away from where I was. So I stayed and I got on my hike, and it was, broadly great. I camped in temperatures down to minus 50 degrees. That's again Celsius. So I guess that's somewhere around minus 65 Fahrenheit. I don't know. And I saw beautiful northern lights. I hung out with reindeer herders who have lived, with this beautiful relationship with their animals up there on the tundra for hundreds, thousands of years. And I got a really interesting sense of specifically that part of Siberia, but also of what ordinary Russian people thought or didn't think or said or didn't feel they could say. It really was the gamut. There was just about everything. But this is a long story, isn't it, to a short question. When I arrived at my finishing line, which was a port town called Tixi on the north coast of Siberia, I was pretty promptly arrested and taken to court on charges of conducting journalism on a tourist visa, which amused me in some sense because years earlier I'd been taken to court in another part of Siberia for conducting tourism on a business visa. And I remember in that court they had a translator who said, you have been committing tourism, which has always amused me. But in this case, there wasn't really adequate translation. And among the other charges were asking provocative questions about the special military operation, as they term the war, the invasion, and most worryingly of all, of photographing restricted military sites, so tantamount to espionage. The sentence, I was found guilty as, let me get this right, 399 out of every 400 cases that go to court in Russia result in a guilty verdict, which doesn't necessarily speak wonders for their judicial system. It's actually a higher conviction rate than under Stalin. And the term kangaroo courts sprung up and bounced around back then. So I think we can agree that Russia has a lot of kangaroo courts today. Putin's Russia. So I was sentenced to a fine and deportation and a ban from Russia. But it turns out that deportation is quite a slow, bureaucratic, unwieldy process. So without really telling me what was going on, they took me down to the regional capital and locked me up and said, "You're here until we let you out." And there I was.
There's so many questions on that. First of all, why the heck were you in Siberia? But that's another thing. You said it was so pleasant. It was negative 60, 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Oh my gosh. But when you arrive at the town, and were there just police waiting for you because they heard what you were doing, or did you?
I had been along my hike. There were settlements roughly once a week, a week's walk apart, and these were mostly just small indigenous villages, so indigenous Siberian people, with 200 or 300 people in each village, not really or no presence of the authorities, the police or the FSB, which is the sort of the modern day successor to the KGB. However, they do still have, particularly in those smaller, quite old-fashioned villages, these are villages that were only formed during collectivization as part of the sort of Soviet project to settle and homogenize the formerly largely nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples who lived up there in the north. these villages still retain quite a lot of the structures of the Soviet era. So they have an administrative head, elders, and as soon as I arrived in the village, people would, as well as being very welcoming and hospitable, would quickly report my presence back to the FSB and the police in the regional capital further south. So I was increasingly made aware that my progress was being tracked, and particularly towards the end, I knew that my arrival in this town, the Finnish town, was kind of daily anticipated. Sometimes when I arrived in a village, people would show me a photograph of my passport on their phone and say, "Is this you?" And I'd say, "Oh yes, it's me." And the vanishingly few vehicles that would overtake me on this ice road would often pull over and go, "Oh, you're Charlie, aren't you?" And I go, "Oh yes." I don't love that you know that. So the word was out. So they were expecting me. But I had one brush with the authorities halfway through the journey. By the time I got to the end, I think they knew what they planned to do with me, the charges they planned to bring against me, the witnesses they planned to coerce to say things against me that weren't true. But I don't hold that against any of those people. People are easily coercible particularly in a country that treats its people as badly as Russia sadly does.
Just couldn't get your visas right. That's all.
Well, the longest tourist visa available when I traveled on a business visa years earlier was only 30 days. Just before my journey, they introduced a new 90-day, my more recent journey, they introduced a new 90-day tourist visa. So I got that. I've been told by a few people, "Oh, you should have got a journalist visa." But I have no doubt that if I got a journalist visa, I would have been even more quickly on the radar of the authorities, and they would have said, "Well, you're not doing journalism, you're doing tourism," and they would have found me guilty for committing tourism regardless. So it doesn't really make sense to try and rationalize how they do things up there, sadly.
If you can be found guilty of committing tourism, yeah, you're probably gonna be found guilty of something.
Exactly. Yeah.
How did the mindset you use on long solo expeditions help or fail to help during that detention?
I have no doubt that month, as I've said, the hardest month of my life, would have been that much harder. That I won't say impossible, because I think we are all capable of enduring so much more than we think. We are all much more resilient when forced to be than we imagine we could be. But I have no doubt that month would have been so much harder if I hadn't spent more than a decade leading up to that point doing difficult things, making my life deliberately difficult. I'm a real staunch advocate of the idea that the best, arguably the only way to really sort of prepare ourselves for the challenges that we don't choose but that we're forced to face is just to throw problems in our path on a daily or yearly basis. Make life difficult, take the high hanging fruit, take the hard road. Because if we don't, then we never really, I think, grow. It's through stress that we grow, through stress that we stretch ourselves.
Did your experience in the Russian prison influence your perception of the current conflict in Ukraine?
That's a good question. I don't think it changed my perception of the conflict itself. But my time in that prison, and probably more so my time in the couple of months leading up to that, when I spent time in Russia talking to Russians, definitely furnished a bit more detail and nuance to my view of Russia and what Russian people think and why they think it. And when you get a sense of quite such a the propaganda in Russia, firstly, is so mad. There is this genuine belief that a Jewish man whose mother suffered during the Holocaust is the president of a neo-Nazi country that has this neo-Nazi, this sort of genocidal neo-Nazi regime. persecuting people in the east of Russia. Lots and lots and lots. I dare say the majority of Russian people do seem to genuinely believe these things because they have had it hammered home day in, day out on the news, on the radio, on the TV. Every last outlet of independent media in Russia has been shut down. The last few surviving outlets were shut in the days after the invasion, and a decade or a lifetime, or frankly several generations of telling people that, to take Orwell's example from 1984, 2 + 2 = 5. People will eventually decide, not believing this is more trouble than it's worth. And I think once you submit to, once you take the path of least resistance for long enough, eventually that will, in some sense, formalize in your mind. There is a pervasive sense of fear and self-preservation in Russia. People don't speak freely. I never heard a single person say anything negative about the war or about Vladimir Putin in front of anyone else during my entire time in Russia. That said, I heard numerous people in the candor of one-on-one conversations say all manner of things, that they thought the war was mad, that the president was evil, that he was a dictator, that they felt ashamed to be Russians during this time. But the fact that no one would say this in front of anyone else gives some indication of how people are perhaps afraid that people they know, friends, even family, might report on them, might report back to the authorities what they've said, inform on them. So that old Soviet era sense of paranoia seems to have rekindled within Russian society. I don't know whether it was ever truly dormant or if it was always there in some low level, and that depth of understanding as to how much more complicated the picture is than I had initially thought is probably the biggest thing I learned about the background to the conflict, let's say.
Was there ever anything more dangerous than the prison you faced on your travels?
I can give you quite a recent example of something that I suppose was more immediately dangerous. I went rock climbing in Oman earlier this year in April, just my wife and I on holiday. And we drove down into the south of the country and drove into quite deep into a wadi, into a sort of an old dry river, a ravine in the desert. And we went quite far off-road, driving over these big, loose, boulders, very uneven surface, totally violating the terms of our rental contract of the car. And we spent a couple of days rock climbing, and we slept, camped out in the desert. We make campfires, cook some dinner, go to sleep. And I slept outdoors because it was about 30 degrees at night, unpleasantly hot to be in a tent, and sleeping under the stars in the desert is one of my great loves. Unfortunately, at about 4:00 one morning, I woke up to a funny sound that I thought was the sound of my sleeping mat deflating. It was right next to my shoulder, close to my neck, and I reached out to kind of feel for air leaking out of my sleeping mat. And it turned out it wasn't a sleeping mat deflating, it was a snake, and it bit me on the thumb, and it turned out to be quite a dangerous viper. In fact, it's the world's the saw-scaled viper is the world's deadliest species of snake. Not the most venomous. That's the taipan in Australia, I believe, but it is very venomous, and it kills more people than every other species of snake put together every year, for the reason that it has strong venom and mad aggression. It's very, very aggressive. Often it bites people twice. Thankfully, it only bit me once on the thumb, and it was quite a rude awakening. But within about an hour, we managed to get to a hospital with antivenom. And on that drive to I was in the passenger seat directing, but on that drive to the hospital, the first Google result that came up when I searched for this snake was some victims can die in less than 30 minutes. Usually you've got up to about 2 hours. So thankfully I got to hospital comfortably within the usual time to save one's life. And 2 days in hospital later, and I was turfed out with nothing beyond a bit of necrotic flesh and some tissue damage, but nothing major, and my thumb looks relatively normal now. So that was probably one of the more dangerous things I've encountered recently, at least.
Yeah, you got to just go to a beach next time and just go sit on the sand.
Yeah, these particular snakes, I think they can also live on beaches, so there's no escape.
Right.
You can't seem to escape adventure. Charlie, when you talk about disinformation in this war, what were the most surprising discrepancies between what you saw on the ground and what you read on global media?
I remember very vividly arriving in a village a couple of days after the Russian troops withdrew from the north of Ukraine, having failed in their sort of blitzkrieg attempt to seize Kyiv. They never took the capital, but they seized sort of suburbs and the Hostomel air base nearby. And as many people will remember, among the places they occupied was a small town outside Kyiv called Bucha. And the reality on the ground was that in the wake of their retreat, they left 400 plus bodies strewn about the town. Not the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers they had been fighting, but bodies of civilians, children, raped children, elderly people with their hands tied behind their backs and executed with a bullet in the back of the head. Just abhorrent scenes of torture, of atrocities. And I remember that coming out. I managed to get access to the internet, and I was starting to get some pieces of information from the few accessible Western news outlets. But meanwhile, I was watching TV in Russia, in this village, and there was talk about how these same scenes that had been found were simultaneously, they were saying that they had been orchestrated by the Ukrainian soldiers, or they had been staged by British and American intelligence as some sort of psyop. And there was just this information noise of all sorts of different stories that all stretched credulity. And it seemed crazy to me, like they're not even doubling down on one lie. They're telling about 30, disagreeing lies. But with hindsight, that's how it works. As Steve Bannon famously said, flood the zone with shit. They just drown the information space with so much misinformation and disinformation and fantasy that people not knowing what to believe anymore will often just sort of fall back on a default of I suppose, optimistic patriotism, hoping and believing that their countrymen would never do such a thing and someone else must have perpetrated it. And that was sort of enlightening and surprising and depressing all in one.
What do you hope people sitting in a comfortable office or listening in their car take away from your stories?
I would hope that they would feel emboldened to learn more about the world. I suppose during this conversation, I have earlier on talked about the mind-blowing excesses of kindness and generosity that I've experienced from average people the world over. And yet in the last few minutes, I've spoken about some of the darkest things I've ever read or heard about. And it's all there, and the latter isn't the default. It's I think and I hope the exception that proves the rule that I stated earlier. But I suppose if people could take one thing away from this, I would hope that it's curiosity to look into things for themselves, to not shy away from complication or nuance. Because if we only ever look at a sort of monochromatic, a black and white view of the world, we end up myopic ourselves.
You've been praised by Sir Ranulph Fiennes for your grit. What means more to you, being remembered as a man of adventure or as a man of faith and family?
Ooh. I mean, not yet having created a family of my own. I suppose for the time being, a man of adventure. But I mean, I occasionally use or have applied to me the term explorer, and I like what that means in the much broader sense of exploring, not necessarily to be a gruff, bedraggled, bearded sort of Victorian bloke traipsing around Africa looking for the source of a river or something, but more someone who is interested to explore the human experience. So I suppose to slightly derail your question, I would go with that for the time being.
Is there like an adventure that you went on that you'd say, this is not for me. I'm not an adventurous guy, Charlie. But if someone listening to this is like, hey, I really want to, this is something sounds so cool to me. What's like the level one? Like, how do you get, what's the starter adventure?
Level one adventure. I guess I'd recommend if to work out where your comfort zone is, and then just go a tiny bit beyond that. So if your comfort zone is not quite sleeping in a tent somewhere near where you live for a night, then maybe try that. If your comfort zone is a week of hiking in the Karakoram Mountains in Pakistan, then maybe make it 3 weeks. So I suppose just work out what you think you can do, what you feel comfortable with, and then just go a little bit further than that.
Comfort zone's my living room.
We have in the sort of adventure world. Are you aware of the different types of fun? Also in the extreme sports world, we talk about this. There's type one fun, which is fun at the time and fun with hindsight, and then there's type two fun, which is not really fun at the time, but fun in hindsight. In hindsight, you're glad you do it. You did it. You got a bit of a rush out of that. And type three fun is not fun at the time and not fun with hindsight.
That's what I'm. That's what this sounds like to me. Biking that far in those areas sounds like type three fun.
It had its moments.
Yeah.
If exploration is the vehicle, what's the destination you're truly aiming for in your heart and in your legacy?
That's a great question. And actually, I don't say this very often. I've never been asked that before. So a true original question. I guess the destination hopefully is knowledge and enjoyment, I think. And I suppose also to try and communicate to people beyond just myself. I'm very aware of how lucky I am, how privileged I am to be in a situation where I can undertake these journeys and to travel to distant corners of the world. And I feel it is almost incumbent upon me to do something with that. So when I come back, I do try to write and create slowly as the years go by a body of work that hopefully people enjoy and can learn something from themselves.
On a more that's an ethereal, pretty intelligent question. On a more basic question, what's your favorite place you visited?
I mean, so this question I get asked very often, and I really struggle with it. I mean, there's two places that I often. I mean, I could, depending on different days, I could give you dozens of different answers there, I guess. But two places that often pop up for me in this respect are Mongolia, for the, I guess, for the boundlessness of it. It is a massive country. It's not as big as the States, but it's not, it's bigger than Spain, France, and Germany combined. It's about the size of East Africa, and there's only 3 million people. So and there's no fences. It's just all common land. You can just roam freely. It's like the world's largest national park. There's mountains and deserts and steppe grasslands and forests and lakes and rivers, and it's a real paradise for adventure. So that's one, and then the other is Iran, somewhere that remains comfortably the friendliest and most welcoming place I've ever been. When traveling in Iran, seldom does a day pass where someone hasn't invited me into their home to stay the night or to feed me. There's really nowhere else in the world like that. And when you throw in the fact that it's a big, beautiful country with varied landscapes and an incredibly storied history and buildings strewn across it from the last 2,500 years, it's quite unrivaled as a place to travel.
After all these journeys, what's next? Is there anywhere else on Earth you still wouldn't dare to cross?
I actually don't yet have my next journey planned. I'm starting to think about it. I've just this week submitted the very final edit of my next book about Siberia. And while that process has been ongoing, I've tried to prevent myself from procrastinating by scanning around Google Earth and looking for what might be next. So maybe I'll have an answer to that in the coming weeks or months. Yeah, sorry, was there a second part to the question? I've blanked.
Is there anywhere on Earth you wouldn't go?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, where wouldn't I go? I don't feel the need to go back to Dubai necessarily. There are certain parts of the world that are perfectly valid, and there's nowhere I probably wouldn't be interested to visit once. But there are certain places that I don't necessarily fire my imagination. I also, while my ban from Russia ends in a couple of years, I believe I'd be very unwise to return while Putinism holds. When with a change of not just leadership but regime, I would very happily, and I'm sure that'll happen in my lifetime, and I will return. By the same metric, sadly, I think the aforementioned Iran is currently somewhere where Westerners would be ill-advised to go for the same reasons of hostage diplomacy. They have been known increasingly in recent years to arrest, essentially abduct Western citizens and then hold them in the hope of some sort of exchange or concessions from their home nation. Beyond that, throw it at me and I'll go.
So how will you, like, what's your process to deciding your next trip? Is it literally Google Earth and roaming around, or is there more to it than that?
There's more to it than that. It's a combination, I suppose, of where I want to go, where's going to provide a good challenge, where's going to be financially feasible, and what's gonna hopefully provide me with the raw material for a story that I can tell later. Where is interesting to me. I also have found over the last few years that once I visit somewhere, short of moving somewhere, you never learn everything about it, even when you move somewhere. So I find I go to somewhere and then I've scratched a little bit beneath the surface, but I find myself returning again and again to the same places to try and learn more. So actually, in recent years, I've not been as good as I used to be at getting to new places. I found myself returning, keen for more.
Now on to our final word segment, where we ask our guests a few rapid-fire questions. What was the happiest moment in your life?
I'm going to shy away from saying my wedding because obviously that goes without saying. And I think most people find that quite unsatisfying as an answer. So I would say the happiest day of my life was returning home from my 4-year bike ride. This moment that I'd been working towards both physically and mentally, and sort of imagining for years, while living quite a sort of hard vagrant life out on the road. So probably that, and I guess that came 4.5 years after the biggest day of my life, which was setting out from home, the same spot in the same village, just 4.5 years apart, the biggest day, and then perhaps the happiest day.
What is the biggest adversity you've faced?
Loneliness. I don't talk about this a huge deal, or rather it doesn't come up all that often necessarily, but once again, during that bicycle journey, yes, that month in a Russian prison cell was the hardest month of my life, but the biggest thing that I've had to wrestle with, over a protracted period of time was loneliness when on my bicycle. And sometimes that manifested when crossing Tibet by myself in the winter and not having a conversation in English for weeks and weeks and weeks, and sometimes not having a conversation at all for a week or two. And then sometimes that would manifest through the sense of just being alone and foreign in a big city without the means to go and eat in a nice place. And I actually found Southeast Asia was the loneliest place that I traveled through, precisely because that it was filled with with Western tourists, and I didn't really feel I had the means, the financial means, and therefore the ability to kind of join in with that. So I felt sort of yet more of an outsider.
What are you most excited about?
Ooh, what am I most excited about? I am gonna answer this with an element of supposition. I feel that over, let's say, the last decade, many things have been moving in directions that I don't love, in the way the world is, the way certain societies, including my own, are run and managed and led, and all manner of things, climate, etc. And I am excited about the moment when that pendulum starts to swing back towards a time of, with a modicum of sensibleness and rationality, and people properly appraising problems for what they are, rather than saying there's either not a problem or we can solve that problem by blaming someone who ultimately perhaps has nothing to do with it. Sounds like I'm speaking in allegory. I'm not really, but yeah, I look forward to that day.
What advice would you give your younger self?
I wouldn't bother. He wouldn't listen. It's simple as that. I've spent my whole life ignoring advice wherever possible. So I suppose I would advise him to go on ignoring advice, and then he might start listening to advice. Glib answer, but honestly, that's true.
Do you have any book recommendations for us or for the listeners?
Ooh, what have I been reading recently? Actually, I'll tell you what. I'm not gonna give a specific recommendation. What I am going to say is, as a man approaching 40, for the last several years, I've read almost exclusively non-fiction. And then just recently, I've reminded myself there are novels, and I've started reading fiction again. And I've sort of once again found how much I love it. And I recommend all the men out there reading about Nazis and the Russian Revolution to every now and again just read a novel, because they are fantastic and they do take you away. They transport you in a way that reading about the kulaks and the gulag can't.
The name of our podcast is Nothing Left Unsaid. Do you have anything you want to say?
Shamelessly, I'm going to say at the end, I've written a couple of excellent books, and if people are interested to read about any of the things I've been talking about today, then please do seek them out. And my next book about Russia, about Siberia, will surface in June next year. So that is a sickeningly self-serving answer, but there you are.
That's perfect.
It's got to be done.
And then, Charlie, before we let you go, at the end of every episode, I ask our guests, who are a couple of people that you know that you think we should try to get on the podcast?
Ooh. I would try Benedict Allen. He's an explorer and a friend of mine, and I think he would say some of the things I've said today with much more eloquence and wisdom, as well as many other things besides. And who else could I offer you? Well, I'm looking up at a bookshelf, and this also touches on, or rather her writing touches on, some of the things I've spoken about today. Anne Applebaum, who is a historian, a writer for The Atlantic, I believe, and one of the best non-fiction writers that I've read. I think she is inspiring, and her books are some of the most sort of authoritative books I've read on, I suppose, autocracy and the Russian bloc, the East European bloc, and Russian history. So I find her very inspiring.
Charlie, you've proved that the real frontier isn't just geographical. It's in our willingness to embrace the unknown and keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles. Your stories remind us that curiosity, resilience, and human connection are universal, whether you are on the far side of the world or right here at home. I hope today's conversation leaves our listeners with a little extra inspiration to carry their own journey. Charlie, thanks again for joining us today, and I hope that God continues to bless you.
That was all very well put. Thank you very much. Tim, Troy, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today. Thank you so much for having me on, and keep doing what you're
Sure.
doing.